podría cerrar la próxima. Good morning, and welcome to our special session of the OCDE. Today we have the participation of Christian Cajona, who visits us from the FTC, and so we have prepared a very interesting panel regarding the accession of Colombia to the OECD and the importance of the OECD for competition law in Colombia. We are broadcasting Facebook Live, and we have the participation of several international agencies and people around the world in Latin America who are watching our event. In my preliminary remarks, I would like to speak a little bit about the importance of the teaching of competition law here at the Javeriana University. First of all, I want to say that the Javeriana University is going to be 400 years old in 2023. So in 5 years we will be 400 years old. Of course, the Jesuit priests were expelled from Colombia several times, and so our university had an interruption in its activities. But in 2021, we will have the 90th anniversary of the reestablishment of the university. So this is very important for us. The Javeriana University was reestablished in 1931, and at this time our law faculty, our law school, was a law school in law and economics. So the initial lawyers from the Javeriana University were both lawyers and economists. From here, we have the importance of the study of economics and law at the Javeriana University. Our pensum is very heavy in law and economics, and we maintain for many years a specialization in socioeconomic sciences. I am one of the last generations of the lawyers who took the specialization in socioeconomic sciences. Now we don't have that, but our pensum remains very heavy in law and economics, and that's how we created the subject of competition law in 1995. In 1995 also we founded the Center for Studies in Competition Law. So we have been running on competition law for 23 years now. For the Javeriana University, it is very important that all the students take competition law, and it's probably one of the only universities in the country in which all students have in their mandatory curriculum the subject of competition law. Our Center for Studies in Competition Law gathers once a month. We had the regular meeting of this month last Friday, and we are able to do like 8 or 9 in the year. So this is, of course, a special meeting because we have a very special guest. We welcome you very much, and we hope that this is only the first time that you speak at the OCDE. It is also very important for us to convey that this panel refers to a very important matter in a very special time. Two of the main projects of President Santos during his tenure were the peace process and the accession to the OECD. The accession to the OECD is very linked to the peace process too, because OECD provides best practices for countries who participate, and the competition area was one of the first to gain approval from OECD. So it has been a very important effort from our competition agency, and we of course follow very closely this process. Today we are gathered here in order to analyze the accession process and what can Colombia benefit from the accession to the OECD, what Colombia can give to the OECD too, and the countries in Latin America who want to gain access in the future to OECD. So for this, we are gathered here and we welcome you all and the persons who are watching us from abroad and from the distance. We welcome everybody to this seminar. We are going to go until 11 a.m. And we have very important panelists that Cristina is now going to present. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the OCDE and also the speakers for allowing us to deliberate on the importance of Colombia's access to the OECD and the challenges that may arise at a national level, especially when it refers to competition protection. First of all, and in order to start with this panel discussion, we think that it's very important to have a brief introduction about what is the OECD or what it's for. So, the Organization for the Economic Cooperation Development, in Spanish, OCDE, was founded in 1961, looking to increase cooperation between nations, especially taking as reference the cooperation process held with the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II. Its main purpose was to promote policies that improve the economic and social well-being of all the people around the world. Specifically, it offered a forum where governments could work together to share experiences and find solutions to common problems. The goal was to work and understand what was driving economic and social change. It also focused on measuring productivity and global flows of trade and investment. With that information, the OECD was able to make trend forecasts and set international standards with a wide range of public policy issues. Right now, the OECD has 37 members, Colombia included, members that at least the idea is that share the same principles of market economy and pluralism democracy. What it refers to their general organization, the structure of the OECD, we can highlight three bodies. The first body is the Council. This is the most important body of the OECD. The Council is the decision-making power of the organization. It's made up of one representative from each member country and one representative from the European Commission. The other body, and maybe this is the most important body or bodies that today we're going to highlight, is the committees. So, the OECD committees are specialized forums that review the progress of specific policy areas, such as trade, employment, and in our case, competition protection, consumer protection. Those committees are in charge actually to study or to understand what is the reality about each country in the specialized topic. Those committees are also conformed by working groups and expert groups. The current organization has, as today, we have 250 bodies. That includes committees, working bodies, and expert groups. And finally, we have the OECD Secretariat. The Secretariat has more than 2,050 staff officials and support the activities of the committees and carry out the mandates and decisions of the Council. Now, I'm going to do a brief introduction about what is the organizational structure about competition protection. So, as I said before, the OECD has a competition committee. This competition committee meets twice a year, and the SIG has been participated since 2013. The OECD headquarters are in France, and they used to discuss in those meetings that are held twice a year relevant issues related to competition protection regimes. We also have two working parties. We have the Working Party 2, which it deals about regulations and competition, and we have Working Party 3 that deals with cooperation and competition. Those working parties has also twice a year meetings, and they used to discuss some topics about competition protection regimes, about leniency programs, bid rigging, advocacy, and it's like a space that you can share experiences and round tables and talk about main topics as, for example, sharing economy platforms. I mean, they have several issues to discuss here. Finally, I would like to highlight some key dates about the accession process, the general accession process of Colombia, and the accession process to the competition committee. So our first approach to the OECD was in January 2011, when President Santos announced the interest of Colombia of making part of this organization. On 2012, an official letter from the Colombian government was sent to point out our intention to begin an accession process. After that, on May 2013, the OECD Council invited Colombia to initiate a formal accession process. On September of the same year, the official roadmap for the Colombian accession process was submitted, where the OECD dictated that 23 OECD committees needed to perform deep reviews and provide a formal opinion to the Council. Here it's important to understand that those committees depends of the country. So, for example, for Colombia, we had to study or to make some changes about 23 committees, but it depends on each country. For example, another country must have more committees or less committees that has to perform a deep review about it. The accession process took 5 years, and finally, in May 25, 2018, the OECD Council decided by unanimity, this is very important, to invite Colombia to accede to the convention, being the third Latin American country to become a member with Mexico and Chile. This is the general process. Now, the process about competition committee started in September 2013 with the request of the OECD Council to undertake a deep review of Colombia. On March 2014, Colombia presented its initial memorandum setting out Colombia's position on each OECD legal instrument, including the 12 recommendations in the field of competition policy. We start with a very, very hard work led by the Superintendents of Industry and Commerce. And finally, on June 2015, the OECD gave to Colombia the go-ahead to join the competition committee. As you can see, we have the go-ahead in 2015 for competition committees, and in 2018 we have the general go-ahead on the general accession process. So this was a really fast and brief introduction about what is the OECD. Now, I think that we are ready to start the panel. So I will start. I think that maybe it's easier to do a presentation. I'm going to do a brief presentation about all of the speakers, and then we're going to start with the discussion. So today, we have the pleasure to have here Mr. Christian Catona. Mr. Catona holds a law degree from the University of Virginia, School of Law, the University of Constance in Germany, Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas University in France, and the Yale University in Canada. He is the Counsel for International Antitrust in the U.S. Federal Trade Commission's Office of International Affairs, and he is responsible for multilateral antitrust affairs and coordinates FTC antitrust enforcement activities with those of European national competition authorities. He also leads the FTC's participation in the OECD competition committee. And then we have Mr. Felipe Serrano. I have here already. Mr. Serrano is lawyer and specialist in commercial law from Universidad Javeriana, specialist in administrative litigation from Universidad Externado, and he has an LLM in trade regulation antitrust from NYU, and the law school master in public policy from University of Oxford and serial studies in Yale and Harvard. He is partner at Serrano Martinez and former chief advisor of the Superintendent of Industry and Commerce from 2002 and 12 and 2015. Unfortunately, today we thought that we will have Jorge Sanchez, our Deputy Superintendent for Competition Protection, but he has a last-minute issue and he won't be able to attend today the panel, so he's very sorry and we have to do it without him. Then we have Mr. Alfonso Miranda. He is partner at Desguerra Asesores Jurídicos, director of the Law and Economics Department of the Javerianas University Law School, and co-founder and director of the Center for Studies in Competition Law, OCDE. He is lawyer and socioeconomist from Javerianas University, specialist in banking law from the Andes University, and has a master's degree in law from Cornell's University. And finally, we have Carlos Esguerra. Carlos is team leader of the 6 Bits Reading Task Force, co-chair of the International Committee of the Colombian Competition Bar Association, and young lawyer representative of the International Antitrust Committee of the American Bar Association, co-director of the International Committee of the Colombian Association of Antitrust Law. He is lawyer from the Andes University, specialist in competition law and administrative law. He has an LLM in competition law from King's College in London, and he has served as legal advisor from the Federal Trade Commission in the International Affairs Unit. So now we're going to start with our first question to Mr. Felipe Serrano. And he is going to talk us about the process to make Colombia's the 37th member of the OECD. He's going to have some perspective about the competition authorities' efforts in this process. So, Mr. Felipe, thank you very much for coming today.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Alfonso Miranda for the invitation and Carlos Esguerra for putting all this together, Cristina, and also to welcome Christian to Colombia. It's a pleasure to have you here. Christian and I met at the OECD, I think before, maybe, but we shared a lot of thoughts and questions within the framework of the OECD Competition Committee, which is what I'd like to talk about today. So I had the privilege between 2012 and 2015 of being in charge of our relationship between the OECD, between the SIG and the OECD, and especially with regards to the accession and to having the the approval of the Competition Committee for accession. So as Cristina was explaining, the OECD functions with 3 main bodies. The first one and the most important is the Council, where the major leaders of each country, or maybe the Ministry of Finance, sit and take the major decisions. And then there are 2 other bodies which do the technical work. The Secretariat is composed by the staff within the OECD that does the technical work. And then we have the committees, which are sort of a scenario where all the authorities meet and discuss a specific topic previously chosen by the agencies. So in the case, for example, of the Competition Committee, Christian will expand on this, but in the case of the Competition Committee, what we usually had twice, before 3 times a year, was roundtables where we sat down and discussed, for example, how are the challenges of competition agencies going with regards to leniency programs, conscious parallelism, abuse of dominance, etc. So this is where all the discussions took place. Twice a year, all the agencies sat down in Paris to discuss all those issues, usually followed by a presentation from a technical expert, etc. So when Carlos was putting this panel together, this event together, he asked me to share the experience of how was the accession process between 2013 and 2015, specifically not only with the mechanics of how it worked, but also with what are my thoughts with regards to what works and what does not work, specifically because some competition agencies which are going through the process right now are watching us. So we thought about maybe giving some thoughts about the experience we had at the SIC. So on September 2013, the OECD, the Council invited Colombia for accession. So at that time we were already attending to the competition committee, but as observers. So basically we just sat down and had the opportunity to hear everyone's thoughts, but we had sort of a marginal participation. But in 2013, the accession started. So Colombia was invited to start a process of accession. And in that process, as Christina said, the OECD had to do 23 in-depth studies, which means peer reviews of Colombia's sort of status in the law and policy in a specific area. So the OECD addresses many technical issues, data protection, consumer protection, competition, etc. Not all of them required an in-depth study. So not all of them required sort of a check from the OECD for Colombia to be accepted to the OECD. They just sort of chose 23 areas which they think had to be addressed, and this, we talked about it at that time, shows the importance the OECD gives to competition. So one of those 23 topics, which were finance, labor, investment, etc., was competition. And in the in-depth study, what the OECD wants to know is the country's ability to comply with the recommendations of the OECD, with their policies, and also the country's willingness to comply with those policies. So these are two important issues. The OECD recognizes that countries sort of comply with several of their policies, of their recommendations, but that others require time to sort of be passed in Congress, etc. So it's a combination of both what we have now and the willingness and the tasks and the activities we're undertaking to sort of advance in complying with all the policies of the OECD. And in practice, what this means is that each committee which has to do an in-depth study of the policies of a country in a particular area, in our case competition, has to do a peer review. And a peer review is a very profound and in-depth study of the laws, policies, and practice of a country's specific topic. In our case, of competition law and policy and how we were executing it in practice, in cases, etc. So the Secretariat does not do the peer review. It appoints an expert. In our case, the expert was Jay Schaefer, which he worked for the FTC several years. He was a person who knew in-depth different competition policies, countries around the world, etc. So he was an excellent expert appointed by the Secretariat. The country actually does sort of pay a contribution for the peer review. and it's a study that takes around 8 months, 6 or 8 months, where the expert reviews every law in the country that has to do with competition. So at the end of the process, I believe he knew Decree 2153 and Law 155 better than all the experts in Colombia. He found things that I believe no one had ever seen. So he reviewed not only specific competition laws, or those which are part of the competition law regime according to Law 1340, but also reviewed specific sectoral laws and found things and contradictions that were really relevant for knowing and having a sort of an overview of the country's competition law. The expert, once he starts analyzing all the laws and regulations, he then performs a visit to the country, 1 or 2 weeks, maybe 2 visits, depends on the country and how the expert wants to handle it. And then he meets with the SIC, he meets with the private practice, which I will later expand on this, on how important it is. And then he meets with other agencies of the country, for example, the superintendents of finance, the superintendents of corporations, etc., or at least those institutions which matter for the purposes of executing competition policy. Then the expert issues an accession review. And the accession review basically handles substantive issues. So he reviews, for example, how are our policies and laws on prosecuting cartels, abuse of dominance. He addresses other unilateral acts which we have, mergers and acquisitions, leniency program, institutional aspects, competition, advocacy, and international matters. So he covers basically everything. He also addresses the, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to review the document, which is public, you can review it and read it, and it's a really interesting document to sort of have for another time, an overview of the competition policy in Colombia. And he then issues some recommendations, and he compares, and this is the most important part of the accession review, he compares the country's laws and its execution with the OECD recommendations. And OECD recommendations is sort of an aspect which has to be treated with very carefully, because recommendations are those taken by the council. So official recommendations are those accepted unanimously by the council, which is the higher body which I was talking to before. And this is particularly important because you may be asking, why, if we did a peer review in 2010 in which the OECD participated and also the IDB, we're performing another peer review 4 years later? And the reason is that the peer review that we did with the OECD directly was an accession review. So what the accession review does is to review carefully our laws and regulations and practice with the OECD specific recommendations taken by the Council. And you'll be surprised that some recommendations, for example, in institutional aspects, don't exist. Which is something that every country is discussing right now. So in 2009, a consultant made a peer review, which is an excellent peer review, etc. But it sort of has institutionally, before the accession process, has no value. It has value for the country, etc. to discuss. But in terms of accession process, it didn't have value. And this is quite important because we cannot assert, for example, the OECD says that a competition agency must be composed by several members, and that the chairman, etc., must have a fixed period in order to be independent. That recommendation does not exist. So this is really important to differentiate. So once the expert issued the peer review, he addressed, as I said, all the laws and regulations, but in practice, in few areas, there were sort of discussion in terms of what to do. So what he concluded, and I'm here sort of quoting, is that Colombia has a strong and respected agency with an appropriate system of enforcement. It has all the laws and the basic laws and regulations to prosecute cartels, abuses of dominance. It has pre-merger review, and it said that the main challenge of the country's competition law was the risk of political influence of the agency. And the question was how to resolve that, because the OECD does not have a recommendation on how the agency should be structured. So it does not have a specific sort of timeline of rule or suggestion, etc., on how it should be. It just said the institution should be independent from political influence. So what the expert and the secretariat, the expert is all the time in conversation with the secretariat, which, as I said, are the people who are inside the OECD, technically working on a specific issue. In this case, the competition team. So he said, look, even though there's no specific recommendation on how the superintendents of industry and commerce should be structured, the suggestion of the peer review is that you have a superintendent or a body, as you wish, which has a fixed period for the exercise of its authority. So, as you know, the superintendent before was an agent of the president that could be appointed and removed at will. So he could last, for example, 1 year and then be removed for, I don't know, a certain political case, etc. So what he said was, since all the authorities have their own institutional framework, and the OECD does not have a specific recommendation, just make sure there's a fixed period for the superintendent, or if you're going to have a body of people deciding the cases, etc., just make sure they do have a staggered terms and fixed terms. And this is very interesting, because, and I've always wondered why the OECD does not have a recommendation on institutional aspects. And discussing this with a lot of people within the OECD is partly because different competition agencies have different schemes which do work. So there's not a specific formula for an effective agency within a specific country. Some competition agencies do have, for example, are directed by one person, and that person may be removed at will. I think that's the case of the Department of Justice. The FTC, on the other hand, is composed by a body of several people. You may expand on this, but there are different authorities which perform one work or another and which are effective. Some of them do the investigation and impose the sanctions. Some of them participate as plaintiffs before a court, etc. And there's not a one recipe fits all. So I think that's why maybe the OECD has not advanced on this point. But in any case, the recommendation was of the expert was make sure you have a fixed period. Because, and the discussion went like this, the independence of a person has to do mostly with not only with who appoints the person, but who can remove the person. So for example, in the US, judges from the Supreme Court are proposed by the president, but they have they do not have a period of time, so they cannot be removed. So they can do whatever they feel is correct, and they're not going to be removed. So that's why the expert Jay Schaefer insisted so much on this. In terms of cartels, he said, look, you have the appropriate laws for prosecuting cartels, but the sanctions may be too small for big companies. So first of all, they're appropriate for most companies, but they may be very small for really big companies, which $20, $30 million may be a very small amount to impose for the damage they may have caused and to be deterrent. So you may consider shifting or adding as a criteria the percentage of turnover to impose a sanction. So this is the superintendent, you have seen him in the news, has insisted very much on this.
Very much.
And this is sort of where most countries are going to. And another thing he proposed in terms of cartels was complete amnesty, both criminal and monetary, for the lenient, the person that came to the agency to sign a leniency agreement. So as you know, at this point, if, for example, you're involved in bait rigging, you can have a sanction, monetary sanction from the SIC, and also you can, also you have committed a crime. So you have to negotiate with the Fiscalía. So he said, look, this really makes no sense. There should be a one window, one negotiation for the person that signs the leniency agreement, and the agreement should extend to criminal offenses. I think this was proposed in the project, in the bill that the SIC was promoting a few years ago. But this caused really very high-level discussion between people, entre penalistas. So they were sort of embracing the dogmatic theory that the Fiscalía was the only one that could prosecute people and then, and of course, quit that prosecution, so that the SIC could not sort of take that task. Other countries have done it. Mexico has done it. Brazil has done it. I think we're the only ones at this point. Not the only ones, but several countries which have sort of modern competition laws have this arrangement. In terms of bid rigging, there's something quite interesting in bid rigging, because the OECD, when they were reviewing a regime, they said, why here in Colombia the institutions publish their budget to people that are going to make a proposal? It makes absolutely no sense. The idea of making a competitive process is that people propose for a specific condition and for a specific product or service, and then you decide, of course you have to have the budget, but why do you publish it? It's like you're giving people, you know, a line to bid. And it was like, yeah, we haven't thought about it. And it absolutely makes no sense to have a competitive process if we, I'm not saying it makes no sense, but it just reduces the profits of having a competitive process. So this was something that we insisted a lot, at least when I was at the SIC. We pushed a lot for a change on that, but there's a sort of a mixture of transparency on what's the budget for the project, and then the other area, which is competition. I'm not sure if other countries do it like that, but I believe if you have a system of competition in public procurement, you shouldn't publish your budget. In terms of mergers, they insisted a lot on local nexus. Now before resolution 10.930 of 2015, in order to determine whether a company had to come before the agency for pre-merger review, we counted several assets. We took into account assets from outside the country, which the OECD said, look, you just need to have a local nexus. So just pay attention on local assets and on local sales. And he also insisted on including conglomerate mergers. So right now, you know, we only review horizontal mergers and vertical mergers, not conglomerate mergers. And also recommended to reduce, to eliminate the 20% of notification threshold we have in the law, as you know. So I mentioned this because some of the things they said we could do, some of the things we could not do. So in terms of independence for the superintendents, this was a recommendation not only for the superintendents of industry and commerce, but also for the superintendents of finance and corporations. So this was a very strong discussion between the superintendents, the presidency, the president's office, and other ministries. And really the solution was to give by law to the superintendent a fixed period, right? But we came to the conclusion that passing the law at that point was extremely risky and very unlikely that it would pass. So what the president did was to dictate a decree where he granted fixed periods of 4 years that were aligned with the president's term to the superintendent of industry and commerce, the superintendent of finance, and the superintendent of corporations. A lot of people said, look, this makes no sense. If you want to give independence to the superintendent from the president should not be allowed to eliminate or change the decree, revert it. So it's not really a fixed period of time. This was a really strong conversation, and the OECD said, look, we are fine with that. And especially there was an interesting consideration, which was that the decree made it politically very strong and very difficult to revert the decree. So that was fine for the OECD at the moment, and that's how it was done. I personally was in favor of passing a law, so having it having this rule by law, but it was what could be done at the time. So and this is a mixture of what's the perfect scenario and what can be done at the time, and then we chose this one, and it worked for the OECD. And so this is one of the suggestions I always give to other countries that are in the process, and it's focus, of course, on the best scenario, but also on a good substitute that may suit the wishes of the OECD. The other thing is we started to evaluate which laws and measures needed to be changed and what could be done by the executive. So so which things didn't need a law. So this is good because when you're in the process and you identify the problems of the system, you actually may demonstrate willingness by changing with the executive, with the president, certain laws which have been identified as not complying with the recommendations. So that's one of the things we did with the resolution that the SIC issued on mergers. So we changed things on local nexus, we changed enough things on the 20%, sort of the procedure at least. We also gave the SIC a seat on the Restrictive Trade Practices Committee in the Ministry of Commerce, which was also a recommendation. And one of the things, I guess, is worth doing beforehand, before the peer review is issued for other authorities, is to identify those things that you know are going to come up, and see what you can change and what you cannot change. And this is one of the things, I guess, mostly work for the SIC. When countries are reviewed, and in general when people are reviewed and institutions, they tend to show what's best of them, right? So it's, oh, we have been enforcing the law very well, and we have been very effective, etc., etc., etc. And I think this process should be used materially to really do an in-depth study and understand what are the problems and to change the law. Not only have an okay from an agency. So I guess that's how agencies should take it, not as a reflection on their work, but as an opportunity to really do something that's going to last for the country and for the regime. And two things are a consequence of that. The first one is to involve practitioners and other people that may do a critique of the agency. And this is one of the things we did with Jay Schaefer. I believe Dr. Miranda talked with him, maybe?
Yes.
And several other practitioners talked to him and expressed their concerns about institutional framework, about procedural law, about a lot of things. So this gives you a perspective as a peer reviewer of what's doing, I mean, what the country's doing okay and what the country's not doing okay. And so this was sort of a policy we had. Let's be candid with the OCDE, with the and transparent with the with Jay Schaefer, so we can have a really a good peer review and not something to just have an okay and a check. And another one was another 2 points just to finish my presentation. Was let's have a practical approach. So I'm a friend of incremental change. I'm usually not a friend of just eliminating what we had and what we have and then setting up a new agency. I believe that doesn't go very well in the end. I think it is what happened with our judiciary with the Constitution of 1991. And I'm a friend of incremental change. So just identifying which things could be done and what small measures could make a big change was part of the policy we adopted. And also showing with executive measures the willingness to change. In the end, what we learned is that we have a strong sort of regime, that we have things to do. We made some changes with the OECD and we have other changes to make, and I believe that's part of the process. Not only make changes, but also start a discussion on other changes that must be done. And also that one size that doesn't fit all. So some institutional arrangements may work for some, others may work for other countries. And when I started in 2013 with this project, one of the sort of the goals, the objectives, was to obtain very fast and very technically the okay from the competition committee. So once the peer review was done, then we had a hearing with all the committee. It was like a final exam, and a final oral exam for those of you who have studied law, for 2 hours, I think, and several countries asked questions, etc. And then the competition committee made a recommendation to the council saying, look, this country complies with the laws and regulations and has the willingness to change all the regulations that are not in line right now. And I was really pleased because we were, I think, the first committee, the first committee to have the okay from all the 23 committees of the OECD. And this was in June 2015. So it was just when I quitted from the agency. So I think it was a really good experience for the country. I think it is an outstanding tool for policy and for understanding the law. And the discussions, I believe, will continue in the framework that Christian will explain after me. And that was the experience. So thank you very much for being here. And if you have any questions over the process, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Felipe. So we will continue with Christian. Christian is going to talk us about how can a country make the best of the OECD from a competition perspective. What should Colombia keep in mind to make its participation as successful and valuable as possible? Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días a todos. Antes de empezar, quisiera agradecer a Cedec, Alfonso y Carlos por la oportunidad de presentar mis ideas esta mañana. Ahora, continuando en inglés, I probably get to the end of my Spanish vocabulary. I have to start with the usual FTC disclaimer that the views are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission or any of its individual commissions. But turning to our topic today, first and foremost, I would like to congratulate Colombia on its recent accession to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It really is a key major milestone in economic development, not only for Colombia, but for Latin American economies as well. And from the international antitrust community, following the competition antitrust developments in Colombia for a number of years, I can tell you that this also is a very warmly and widely welcomed development from the international antitrust community that now Colombia is also part as the 37th member of the OECD. And I very much look forward to our discussion today to talk about the impact of Colombia's accession to the OECD on its competition regime and competition antitrust developments, and also very importantly, what benefits as a member Colombia can gain from OECD membership, and in addition to that, if there are any particular responsibilities that through OECD accession and membership now Colombia has to fulfill. Following up on some of the previous points Christina and Felipe made as well. So the OECD is an international and intergovernmental forum that fosters international cooperation, convergence, and the exchange of views and ideas and practices in antitrust policy and enforcement. But how can a country, a member country, can benefit from those particular work products and those activities of an organization? And what can Colombia gain from OECD membership? I think we briefly touched up on some of the work products before, but I would like to provide a little more detail with regard to some of the very key and important work that the OECD Competition Committee and its working parties do in the antitrust area. And first and foremost, I would like to start with some of the recommendations that perhaps are the most important work products of the OECD Competition Committee. When we think about some of the recommendations, and Felipe talked about how, as an accession country, and throughout an accession review, each and every country has to comply with these recommendations, what are the ones that really have proven extremely important throughout the development of competition laws? And first and foremost, perhaps I would mention the Carta recommendation of the OECD Competition Committee, which dates back from 1998. And that was at a time when, when it comes to competition enforcement, the agencies that have been doing enforcement and conduct investigations have already known that cartels are really the area that are the most harmful for consumers and that really hurt most the competitive process and competition. And through the adoption of this cartel recommendation in 1998, it really was an extremely important step for countries that at that point either had not had competition laws or were just in the early stages of implementing their own competition regimes to think about truly what is the key important points that they have to fight. What are the important enforcement priorities that independent competition authorities have to deal with? And on top of that list, on the list of priorities, throughout the cartel recommendation and the broad buy-in for the idea that they hurt most consumers in the competitive process, the cartel recommendation has been an extremely important step for members and observers and others alike in the competition community. Similarly, in 2005, the OECD Council adopted a recommendation on merger reviews and how merger reviews are conducted. This was at a time when there was at a substantive level of convergence throughout the work of other organizations in international antitrust policy, most of the International Competition Network, the ICN, many of you have probably heard about. The ICN has done significant work on how to kind of like summarize, how to provide best practices for countries, what a competition authority has to do when they look at mergers and how merger review process has to be conducted. And in 2005, following up significantly on the work of the ICN, the OECD also adopted a council recommendation on merger reviews, which again has proven since then extremely useful. Some of the examples Felipe mentioned when it comes to notification thresholds or local nexus in merger review come from this particular recommendation that since then have been adopted into the merger regulations and the competition laws of every OECD member. Just one other recommendation that I would mention, which has been extremely important over the decades as well, is the recommendation on international enforcement cooperation. And the very first version of that particular OECD recommendation dates back from 1967. If you think about the development of competition regimes over time, in 1967, there were very few agencies and very few competition regimes that actively enforced competition laws. You could think about, the United States, you could think about Japan, some countries, Germany in the European Union or so. But in general, there were way fewer than perhaps 10 competition authorities that at that point looked at and seriously enforced competition laws. Over time, the 1967 International Cooperation Recommendation, which very importantly called for even the few members, the few active competition regimes for more cooperation. Since then, as you know, over today, we have over 130 competition authorities that actively enforce competition law. There's a huge jump over the last 2-3 decades, how many agencies have started actively enforcing competition laws. In response to all those developments in real world and real time, the OECD often goes back to previous recommendations and it looks whether what we had before still fulfills today's landscape, today's economic environment, today's competition activities of agencies as well as emerging parties and companies in the marketplace. So a number of times the International Cooperation Recommendation has been reviewed and revised, and most recently that took place in 2014 in the OECD, which again calls for more international cooperation among competition agencies. So when it comes to recommendations, they are one of the key work products that the country can, as a member, benefit from. But we previously talked briefly about some of the roundtables that take place as part of the meetings of the OECD Competition Committee, and how these roundtables are done and conducted, and how the topics for those roundtables are selected. And just to give you a few examples, they really are kind of like the leading discussions of particular competition issues that the members themselves propose for the next meetings. So some recent examples include discussions on merger remedies and how to conduct merger remedies and how to impose merger remedies that also are also compatible in case it's multinational or it's multi-jurisdiction investigation or merger review that are compatible with other jurisdictions' reviews and investigations. Another example is in more and more jurisdictions there are significant competition issues, for example, in the pharmaceutical space, pharmaceuticals, medical devices. So the competition committee and its working parties recently conducted a number of meetings and discussions on perhaps how to deal with the issues of generic pharmaceuticals in the pharmaceutical space. What are the competition issues in this area and how those can be addressed. And we also learn, when it comes to these roundtables, it's very important that the sharing makes kind of like the work product more useful. So when it comes to different agencies, they do talk about recent matters, recent investigations they conducted in this space. They talk about market studies that they conducted in particular areas. And they can, be very helpful and beneficial for other member countries that participate in meetings to learn from. Perhaps they face similar issues, they may not have the answers yet, but just, an idea, an investigation, just an enforcement approach can be useful on how they will approach and how they will address particular issues in that space. And just one last example from one of the recent roundtables that I also wanted to add is the importance of coordination of leniency programs, and I know that Alfonso will talk about that later today. But it's just, again, an area in which there are very significant developments over countries, and it's extremely important that when we think about a forum that focuses on cooperation among these members, then there has to be some kind of discussion on making sure that agencies that look at the same issues or look at similar investigations do talk to each other and do compare notes, and hopefully they do come to outcomes that will be not incompatible over time. Very important, and I think Felipe alluded to that as well, that once these roundtables are conducted, which often are really the only forum or the only session that focuses on one particular topic. When we think about particular substantive interest issue, of course all of us can find a number of articles. There obviously are many academic experts, professors, practitioners writing about particular pieces. But often you do not necessarily have country-specific descriptions of how an agency, how a country views those issues. And these compilations of those documents that come from written submissions and also the summaries of the discussions can provide that framework that when one looks into a particular issue, perhaps a member country has an issue with one particular merger remedy, they can look up what other countries did, and it doesn't just go away once the discussion takes place, but the OECD Secretariat publishes all these proceedings, and they are publicly available. One other area that the OECD Competition Committee has recently really been focusing on is what they call hearings. And those are somewhat different from the roundtables that usually focus more on the experience of individual members. When it comes to hearings, they are conducted when there are new issues in competition enforcement and policies that perhaps not many or perhaps no competition agency has dealt with in the past. If you think about some of the kind of hot button topics today in antitrust, so many people talk about, for example, big data. Is big data a competition issue? Or I think in many jurisdictions, many countries, you've heard about very significant issues, including in the competition area, focusing on sharing economic platforms. What are the competition issues in that regard? The OECD over time has conducted a number of so-called hearings to which it invites, academic experts who already have looked at these issues, who have published, and that can present on these issues, but perhaps agencies themselves have not addressed them yet. And then from this kind of learning experience, every agency can see if, what they have in their particular jurisdiction, in their market, are those raising to the point of, needing competition enforcement responses, or perhaps advocacy responses, as we often see in the sharing economy space, in the transportation sector, in, hotel sector, and some of the players that many of us think about when it comes to a new phenomenon in the marketplace, such as a sharing economy platform. And in that regard, it's a forward-looking way of addressing issues that will or may not change or turn into competition issues, but it's still very useful to compare notes and think about how we as competition enforcers can think about these issues in the future. And one last item among the key work products and activities of the OECD Competition Committee I wanted to touch on that has previously been alluded to is the peer review process. How helpful and how useful it can be for a competition regime to get peer review. What happens is, in addition to the accession reviews, which automatically have to take place when a country aspires to become a competition or a member of the competition committee of the OECD. Other countries often request that they be peer-reviewed by the OECD competition committee to have an understanding of how they're doing, how the competition regime functions, what are the institutional setup, what are the institutional framework issues, if any, they have to address. You know, what are the enforcement and advocacy issues or challenges they face, and whether their responses to all of those questions are adequate, or they meet the requirement of, for example, OECD recommendations. And just to give you a couple of examples, it can be very important, say, when a country is considering reform in the antitrust space. In 2010, Brazil has had a peer review that very importantly focused on some of the issues in the Brazilian competition regime that Brazil has for years tried to address. There was a draft law in the works for a number of years. Brazil's previous competition law dates from 1994. And the competition community, including at that time the 3 antitrust agencies that dealt with antitrust enforcement, also were of the opinion that some change needs to be made in the merger area, in the conduct area, and then perhaps also with the system of having 3 agencies looking at particular matters at very different stages. Brazil, to respond to this, brought their ideas to the OECD competition committee, and in 2010 there was an excellent peer review conducted by the OECD reviewing the Brazilian regime. And also, at the end of it, as Felipe mentioned how it was with the Colombian peer review, there were very important recommendations that were made by the OECD competition committee, including its members, to provide the Brazilians with a roadmap. If they are making any changes based on the OECD acquis, these would be very important changes or recommendations to think about and make changes. The next year, in 2011, the Brazilian Congress adopted the country's new competition law, which went into effect in May 2012. Many of those recommendations that the OECD suggested for the Brazilian competition delegates were actually built into the law. And in that regard, it can be very important that when you get peer reviewed, it can be useful for a member or just an accession member or an accession country, or also the observers, that they can go back to their own country and perhaps to the Congress with the credibility, with the reputation the OECD as an international organization has, to say, these are the recommendations we received that we have been considering for quite some time. And in that regard, changes or peer reviews like this can be a very significant impetus for reform in the particular country that goes through peer review. I also want to touch upon some of the OECD outreach activities that any member can benefit from. And in addition to the meetings that take place in the framework of the competition committee and its 2 working parties, it's very important that the OECD annually hosts a so-called global forum on competition. The next one will take place during the last week of November in Paris. And the global forum actually invites, in addition to the 37 members now of the OECD and observers of the competition committee, it invites any other jurisdiction, any other competition agency that's interested in participating in the global forum meetings. Over the last few years, that meant that there were over 100 countries that participated in these meetings, which again provided a broader forum for exchange of ideas and practices, and also to discuss best practices in substantive antitrust areas. Usually these global forums focus on broader topics. When we think about competition, some people, I think we all are responsible for this, may get lost in thinking that, you know, competition exists in its own space. But it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's very important to think about it, how competition relates to other policy areas. And for the Global Forum on Competition, the topics that this particular forum addresses, they usually focus on broader issues. For example, competition, anti-corruption. What is the interface of those particular areas? How do they actually have to be looked at when it comes to competition agencies in some jurisdictions looking at competition issues? But perhaps there are other agencies, other sector regulators, other parts of government, ministries or so, that also take part in the process in one particular policy area. At the next meeting at the end of November, the OECD Global Forum, for example, will address competition and fairness, and whether competition as a policy area can provide benefits for the fairness of a society. The question is out there. I think there's no particular response to this right now, but it will be interesting to hear different views, ideas, and thoughts on all those issues. And just briefly on some of the other outreach activities a member can benefit from, one of them is the so-called Latin American and Caribbean Competition Forum, which the SIC has been participating in for a number of years. And the next meetings will take place in September in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And this is again a forum that is very important regionally for Colombia as a new member to continue participating with all the other Latin American and Caribbean forces in this space. And just one other thing I wanted to mention, which is country-specific projects have been taking up more and more of the efforts of the OECD outreach agenda. And to give you a couple of examples, bid rigging has been one that is a very important topic in a number of jurisdictions. And there have been significant developments, including in Colombia with the recent setup of the bid rigging task force within the SIC, and I know Carlos will touch upon some of those relevant issues. But when it comes to particular bid rigging country projects, the OECD and its secretariat actually very importantly does country projects in which it looks at the bid rigging system, the bid rigging framework, and the bid rigging authorities, the ones that deal with bid rigging and enforce the laws in that particular space. They look at it in one particular country, and the recent example included Mexico. And to see how the bid rigging system works, what could agencies do better? Is there any room for improvement? Or perhaps everything is great in that particular jurisdiction, and what the enforcer does in that area is to be applauded and to be continued, but there's no particular change or reform needed in that space. And as a member, I think this is an area that Colombia can again think about, whether it's bid rigging or whether it's competition assessment or any other substantive area that the OECD has been doing these country-specific projects. I think Alfonso mentioned in his initial remarks that very importantly, the OECD is a forum to exchange views and ideas, but very important, we have to learn about what the best practices in one particular area are, and how those could be further disseminated among jurisdictions, be it members or non-members that closely follow the OECD's work and its work products. And these best practices are really the key and the most important element of the OECD's competition work, because through adopting and the adoption of these particular best practices, some of the examples include in the cartel area, in the major area I talked about before, they really can improve the performance, they really can improve a country's competition regime itself, so they can have long-term benefits over time, which you now see as many competition agents in many countries adopted competition laws over the last few decades, how the adoption of best practices that were conducted by international organizations, the OECD, ICM, UNCTAD, and others, how they really lifted, how competition enforcement and policies thought about and done in different jurisdictions. And this is probably the most important benefit that every country and every member has to continuously strive for. I would like to mention one other thing when it comes to the benefits or potential benefits of membership in the OECD for Colombia, which is, we can't forget about the fact that we are all humans, enforcers. And when it comes to these meetings, they are week-long in Paris, there's a lot of professional contacts being built. Just from the fact that you will get to know people on the other side, you will get to know people, from other agencies, other enforcers, who perhaps a week or two or a month after you come back from the particular meeting, we look at the same picture, we look at the same investigation. Over the years, we have learned that international cooperation is probably the most important thing when it comes to coordinating investigations and merger reviews in the antitrust field. And just to have those professional contacts to rely on, to build on, and to know who to actually call, when you're looking at a particular matter and you know that another jurisdiction, another agency looks at that matter too, this will lead to very significant enforcement and also policy cooperation in this case. And that can be, a general substantive antitrust issue. Hey, we're looking at a particular generic pharmaceutical issue in the marketplace. How would your agency that have dealt with these issues in the past approach that particular topic? But on the other hand, it can also be very importantly actual enforcement and case cooperation examples. When you have international merger reviews, today in more and more instances, they are reviewed, a particular international merger may be reviewed by 10, 20, 30, 40 countries and competition authorities to make sure that you will end up with remedies that are not incompatible, that you coordinate remedies, actually is for that particular goal, it's crucial to have those professional contacts you can only build through in-person meetings and follow-up calls. I think I briefly mentioned before the kind of like broader sense of having competition built into like the OECD as an international organization and its policy areas. So that competition doesn't exist just in a vacuum, but it's related to other important policy areas. What are the interfaces of trade and competition? You know, investment and competition, or what we hear more and more about, you know, data protection and privacy issues. You know, example is big data. Is there anything for competition authorities to do in that space? Is there something that competition authorities are not doing right now they should be doing? And it's very important that the OECD organizes these kind of discussions to bring experts in other policy areas together, including competition and perhaps privacy and data protection, consumer protection, to discuss issues that we all view in different policy areas, but to make sure that we coordinate responses to them, whether it's enforcement responses, whether it's advocacy responses, but how we actually have to deal with these particular issues that pop up in other policy areas as well. And for that, the OECD does a number of so-called horizontal projects that kind of like go over a number of policy areas. One of the most important ones right now is in the digital economy that we hear more and more about. Online marketing, in addition to competition. Are there data privacy or consumer protection issues in that space? I think we all have a sense that there are, but let's make sure that we coordinate our approaches with other enforcers in that space as well. And then I wanted to very importantly mention Colombia's what I call special responsibility when it comes to, you know, OECD membership. Again, Colombia became the most recently acceded member to the organization as its 37th member. But it's very important to think about the fact that there are others in the pipeline, you know, who are interested in membership within the organization. There are others that perhaps have not gotten to the point that they will officially apply for OECD membership and go through the accession review process that has been discussed, but perhaps just have it as a long-term goal in the future. So they're trying to see and trying to evaluate and assess what has been done by Colombia, what have been the changes that over the last years, last decade, last 20 years, Colombia has done, so that we can get hopefully to the same point over the next 5, 10, 20 years. What have been the challenges Colombia faced? Some of the issues that, you know, we talked about, including with regard to institutional framework, and then the setup of the agency and competition enforcement of the country. Some other issues including the merger area, or, you know, abuse of dominance, cartel investigations, bid rigging. How has Colombia faced those challenges, and what lessons has it learned from doing so? And that's why it's a very important thing to think about, that in addition to other Latin American countries, Colombia plays a very important role as an example for other countries that will aspire OECD membership in the future, and try to see how the adoption of best practices, how the adoption of, you know, international, you know, like best standards work in this jurisdiction, and what they can take away from that. Alfonso, I don't know how I'm doing with time.
You're fine.
Or Christina?
Yes.
She's the time coach.
I know. Thank you, Christina. Because I know that I was also asked to provide some small additional tips regarding kind of like how Colombia could get most
Please,
of its
you are our guest today. You have no minutes.
Okay, I would have a couple more minutes on that if you allow me. One of the things I wanted to mention, perhaps is the most important, when how an agency, how a country, and how competition agency could kind of like benefit most from its membership and you know, participation in the OECD competition committee, is truly to have, you know, high-level, active and regular engagement and participation in the body itself. I don't think it's a surprise to any of us that the more you put into something, the more you participate in something, the more you can gain out of it. If, you know, you don't attend meetings, it's very hard to expect any benefit from that. If you don't provide, you know, like your experience, others will not learn from you, so it would be more difficult to connect with you. But it's something that I think has to be underscored, that has been done excellently by the SIC for a number of years. Felipe mentioned that even before being a member, you know, the SIC has already participated as an observer in the meetings, again, at a different level of engagement or so, but already sent, you know, like very senior officials, including the superintendent, the deputy superintendent, the chief advisor, and others, chief economists, I remember a number of times attending the meetings. So it's crucial to continue that level of agency commitment and participation in the meetings to actually gain the most out of it. And it's also very important to think about the fact that when it comes to the number of bodies of the OECD, there are many committees, many working groups, many working parties to which countries do not necessarily send their top-level officials. And in that regard, those discussions can be useful, but perhaps when the discussions do not take place at the highest level, they may not be that beneficial when countries, when the delegates return to their capitals and they provide the, what they learned at the particular meeting to others. In the competition committee, as a general matter, I think it's a very welcome thing that it's pretty much, senior and top officials from every agency participating, including often the agency heads or very senior officials. And if the SIC wants to continue to coordinate, with other countries and participate and be engaged in the work of the OECD, it's very important to keep up that focus. But again, I would like to applaud the SIC for that high-level engagement and commitment over the years. One other thing I wanted to mention is, I think Christina mentioned the Secretariat as part of her remarks, and it's very important that when new members join the organization, what I have seen over the past 11, 12 years that I've been doing OECD work, perhaps they do not necessarily rely enough on the expertise of the Secretariat. When we step back, the OECD has this professional secretariat that Christina described for every committee and every working party, supporting the work of the committee and supporting the work of the members. When it comes to the competition committee, there's a professional member or a professional body of over 25 people who work as part of the OECD competition division. And they prepare, the backgrounds for particular meetings. They really are the researchers and they also run the meetings. And in that regard, it's very important that when it comes to coordinating the work a country does with them, things like the country-specific projects could be very important. A number of these members from the Secretariat, they are the ones who run, the bid projects in Mexico, the competition assessment projects in Ukraine, Portugal, or in other jurisdictions. So working with them and relying on their expertise can be very beneficial for a new member that I think is often overlooked and really should be used more. When it comes to other potential ways to maximize, the potential benefits of a new member in the organization, I think it's very important. What I have seen is to have a very active and professional so-called mission to the OECD in the French capital. The OECD is seated in Paris, and as part of its headquarters, it also has a number of missions from every member, headed by an ambassador to the OECD, and headed by professional staff members who are usually foreign service officers from that jurisdiction. We work, as part of my experience in the USFDC, we work very closely on a daily basis with our contacts at the US mission to the OECD. And they really are the ears and eyes, on the ground in Paris, working with the OECD Secretariat on a daily basis. We focus more on competition issues. I work in a competition enforcement agency. But when it comes to particular, interdisciplinary topics or so, it's very important to hear from those on the ground at the US mission to the OECD to say that, there's this particular topic or project that has come up that would have some relevant competition, provisions or so. Or please, could you please review over a short period of time, usually these are very tight schedules, but there's a particular document that, has some competition relevant language. And I think when it comes to providing that level of expertise at the missions, if it's possible, at the missions, it's very important to have someone who perhaps has competition and trust experience or experience in a related field, be it trade, investment, or so, that immediately recognizes that there are potential competition issues with a particular issue or with a particular topic, and then can refer back to you at the SIC so you can work with them closer as well. I think those are the key points I wanted to address. In case you have any questions or so, I look forward to any further discussion, and I think I would like to close with that. Muchas gracias por su atención.
very much, Christian. We will have a 20 minutes break, and then we will continue with the panel discussion. Thank you.